this session today is looking at youth and children and youth in rural and coastal communities, and looking at their needs and how we might go about meeting those needs, and perhaps what we have been overlooking or what you might have noticed in your roles that isn't perhaps being done as well as we could be doing. To introduce this a little bit more, we're joined today by Gemma Hyde, who works with the Town and Country Planning Association, and she's going to give us a little bit of an introductory presentation just to get us all thinking about this topic, and she's going to share what they've been doing around supporting youth. So Gemma, if I could hand over to you to introduce yourself and do the short presentation for us.
Sure, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. I'll just share my slide. But yeah, so I'm Gemma Hyde. I'm a Projects and Policy Manager at the TCPA, Town and Country Planning Association, and we are a charity with a vision of homes, places and communities in which everyone can thrive. And I'm not going to deep dive into everything we do, but essentially we're interested in the planning system, but also placemaking in terms of places that are good for everybody. Can you see my slides, by the way? Yep, good. So we have been around for a long time, 125 years. We came out of the Garden City movement, if any of you are familiar with that. But essentially, that sort of marriage of countryside and city, so what you get from living in both, the best bits, how do we do places better for people, and what are the ingredients of a good life in terms of where you live. So I do that, and my focus within the TCPA is on health, so healthier places, what creates a healthy place, how the built environment intersects with the wider determinants of health, and all those good things. And so my background is a bit of a mashup between public health and planning, and I sort of don't neatly fall into either, but I sort of sit between the two and work on things from that point of view. So we have been doing quite a lot of work recently around children and young people, and some of that is because there's been a bit of a groundswell in terms of thinking about what children and young people need from the places that they live, and actually why it's so critical that we take into account children and young people's needs from the places where they live. And so at the end of last year, we published this report about why it matters. And what this report did was it took the evidence from a government select committee inquiry into children and young people in the built environment, and unfortunately, the committee couldn't report back to government because of the general election that was called last year. So they had gathered all of this beautiful, wonderful evidence, and it was just going to sit there on a government website. And so working with some partners, we managed to step in and try and summarise it and make it into something useful for people. So what we did when we looked at the evidence is we sort of tried to group it into these 7 themes. So these are the themes that came out. So they cover sort of this high level government and ways of working, and it includes a recommendation that actually at the very highest level we need a minister for children and young people, someone who sits outside of the Department for Education, because at the moment what happens far too much is that we think children and we silo them in either to education or, if they're lucky, into play and leisure, but we don't think about children and young people holistically. We don't think about their rights, even though we are a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. In the planning system, planning is almost silent on children and young people, and the fact that we should be thinking about their needs and asking them what they want. So youth voice is a particularly absent sort of area within the planning system. And then just thinking about children's spatial geographies, their spatial lives. Well, they exist within sort of homes, streets and neighbourhoods. They don't sort of travel such great distances. They're not necessarily commuting for hours to work and back every day. So, they know a lot about where they live, and we need to be respectful of their sort of smaller geographies and how we make those better for people. Thinking about play, not only access to play, playful environments, play parks, but also our attitudes towards children and play. And there's a bit of work to be done there. And then thinking about the importance of green space and nature, and absolutely healthy homes. So I was just thinking about this, and I thought this diagram might help a bit. But one way of thinking about child-friendly places. Now, I apologise that it says city, because I know that in this sort of rural conversation, that's a problem. So it's not my diagram, so I couldn't change it. But just ignore the city part and just think about child-friendly places, child-friendly villages or towns or environments. What's really important for children is that they need things to do, and they need to be able to move around to do those things. So it's, if you have this sort of bottom left box where there's nothing to do and they can't move around, it's like we're essentially confining them into a space. And then we wonder, about what they're doing within that space, if they're using social media and computers and things. We've not given them any other options really. So we need to sort of move towards this thing where there's more things to do around them, but also they have the ability to go and find those things and do those things with an appropriate degree of independent mobility. So in that sort of rural context, I think the 4 sort of things stood out to me thinking about this. One was this access to nature. It's really easy to assume that if you live somewhere rural, you're surrounded by nature. It's there, it's easy to access, and you get the benefits from it. And I think there's some challenges in there that we need to really think hard about in terms of land ownership, and in terms of some of these beautiful spaces that might be around, but that actually children, young people can't even get to, let alone get the benefits from. There's always, wherever we're talking about, an issue around play, and how we create environments that are that encourage play, and that absolutely include infrastructure for play, but also just space. In that public realm within your village or your town, where can children go to play? And if they go to those places to play, do they feel welcome? Is their behaviour treated as antisocial? Far too often, especially for young people, when they're in the public realm, we see them as a nuisance at best and antisocial behaviour at worst. And there's some real sort of societal questions that we need to be asking ourselves about. Are we accepting of children and young people in the public realm, and how do they and their behaviours in that place, and seeing it as play rather than anything else? So there's lots of things that can be done at a very local level around play, and that could be as simple as thinking about a play strategy for a place, and just having a bit of an overview of what's on offer and how it's used, and then also what children and young people want, which brings us on to voice in a second. And there's also ways of looking at what we call place efficiency. So you can actually make an assessment about, is there enough space to play, and that involves this whole sort of attitude toward play around making opportunities, allowing for time for it, and things like that. An absolutely big thing that we talk about is also this idea of movement and connection. And for our children and young people in rural areas, that can be challenging because of road speeds. It can be challenging because of the type of roads that are on offer, and whether or not there is actually space. So more often than not, there's not even a pavement, let alone cycling infrastructure or anything like that. So what are the sorts of things that we might be able to do to sort of mitigate some of those problems? So it might be things like quiet lanes, for example, or green lanes. There's sometimes slow ways, even different sorts of names for the same thing, but actually thinking about and mapping out dedicated routes where we lower the speed environment, and we make it clear that actually that's a shared space and not just for vehicle movements. And obviously public transport is a huge thing, making that affordable, making that reliable, so that people can move around, and just thinking about the connections between places. So if our children and young people, for example, are trying to get to school, how can we support them to do that? And there's some interesting case studies out there working with private landowners and actually building the relationship and allowing children a route across private land in order to get from villages to a school, for example. And then finally, just thinking about that listening and capturing of voice and actually that children and young people have an awful lot to say about where they live, and they have some brilliant ideas and they understand what they need and want from it. And so we have obviously a responsibility as adults to do things for their benefit, but we also really need to be listening. And so on that note, I was just going to flag a couple of things. So this is the Place Standard tool, which some of you may have come across. It was developed in Scotland, but it's open access. And it's just a really great way of asking children and young people, is the place where I live a good place? And it has these sort of different themes and topics, and you can do sort of mapping against those, and you can sort of make an assessment about whether or not it works for them and what they like about it. And it leads to some great conversations. So if you were interested in that, it could be used. From a planning point of view, one of the opportunities within rural areas is neighbourhood planning. And we can pick up on that in the conversation if that's useful to anybody. But it's where there's sort of a spatial development plan for a neighbourhood, usually created by a parish council or a town council. And that's a great opportunity to actually bring in young people's voices in that place and think about these different things that they would like from their place and how they might influence those. And then I was also going to flag this toolkit as well, which is called Voice Opportunity Power. Which is something that we were part of the development of alongside Sport England, Grosvenor and ZCD Architects. It's a bit more specific, so this is much more useful in terms of if there's a regeneration project, for example, going on in a neighbourhood and you wanted to use it to sort of get young people involved in that from the very beginning, so from the outset, but then seeing that all the way through in terms of things like meanwhile uses as the project goes on, and then their sort of feedback on final designs and how that comes forward. And if you're interested, we're actually doing a webinar on Voice Opportunity Power on the 24th of March, which is Monday. It's just a lunchtime, 12 till 1, and it will just be a bit of a deeper dive into that tool. So yeah, that's the sorts of things that we've been looking at in terms of thinking about the built environment and children and young people over the last few months. And happy to be here and join in any sort of conversations that come up from this.
Thank you very much, Gemma. That was really great. I just want to open the floor now to all of you, just for some questions to Gemma based on what she's been talking about. So please go ahead if you do have any questions.